Victoria Harrington had never lost a bet in her life. Not once. Not in the boardroom, not at the negotiating table, and certainly not in the quiet, ruthless arena of her own mind, where she spent most of her waking hours calculating odds and outcomes with the cold precision of a seasoned trader. She was 35 years old, the founder and chief executive of Harrington Tech Solutions, a company she had built from a 2-bedroom apartment and a maxed-out credit card into a $400 million enterprise that employed over 1,200 people across 9 states. She had been on the cover of 3 business magazines in the past 2 years. She owned a penthouse in Manhattan, a beach house in the Hamptons, and a garage that most grown men would weep openly upon entering. She had a reputation, carefully maintained and entirely accurate, for seeing problems before they fully formed and solving them before other people had finished reading the briefing memo. She was, in short, a woman who was used to being right, not in the showy, aggressive way of people who need to be right, but in the quieter, more dangerous way of people who simply are, most of the time, and who have built a life that reflects this fact at every level. But when her beloved vintage Porsche died without warning on a quiet country road one Saturday afternoon, and when every expert in a 300-mile radius failed to explain why Victoria Harrington walked into a small, unremarkable garage on the edge of town, looked a grease-covered mechanic named Ethan Carter up and down, and made the most expensive wager of her life. 3 hours later, the entire garage fell silent as Ethan held up a single component between 2 fingers. It was worth $6. She had bought the Porsche the year she turned 26. The same week, her first real investor had signed the check that saved her fledgling software company from collapse. It was a 1973 Porsche 911, painted in a shade of deep midnight blue that shifted toward violet in certain light, the kind of color that looked like something between a secret and a bruise. Most people who saw it assumed it was just another rich woman's toy, another status symbol parked between the Lamborghini and the Ferrari, in the climate-controlled garage on the lower level of her Manhattan building. They were wrong. The other cars were investments, conversation pieces, mechanical jewelry that Victoria purchased with the same detached calculation she applied to real estate or company acquisitions. But the Porsche was different. The Porsche was the only object in her life that she had ever allowed herself to love without condition. She had driven it to every major milestone of her career: the first office lease, the first acquisition, the first time the company crossed $100 million in annual revenue. She kept a photograph in the glove box of herself at 26, standing beside it in a parking lot with a check in her hand and tears she had refused to let fall shining in her eyes. That car was not a possession. It was a record of everything she had survived, which was why, on that Saturday in late October, when the engine sputtered twice and died on a 2-lane road somewhere between her Hamptons house and the city, Victoria did not feel the mild inconvenience she would have felt if it had been the Ferrari. She felt something much closer to dread. She sat behind the wheel for a long moment after the engine went quiet, listening to the October wind move through the dry grass on either side of the road, and then she called her personal assistant and asked for a flatbed. By the time the truck arrived, she had composed herself, completely straightened her coat, and arranged her face into the expression of calm authority that had become her default setting over the past decade. She watched the Porsche loaded onto the flatbed with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and told herself, with absolute certainty, that this would be resolved by Monday. She directed the driver to take the car to Precision Automotive Group, the most prestigious service facility in the tri-state area, where the lead technician had personally maintained the private collections of 2 senators and a former Formula One driver. It would be fine. She would drop it off Saturday, pick it up Tuesday at the latest, and the only consequence would be an invoice she would sign without reading. That was how her world worked. Problems had price tags, and she could afford all of them. The lead engineer at Precision Automotive was a man named Gerald, who wore a pressed white shirt under his diagnostic apron and spoke about mechanical systems the way a surgeon speaks about anatomy, with quiet reverence and absolute authority. He ran the car through their full diagnostic suite, a process involving 3 different computer systems, a fiber optic inspection camera, and a pressure testing rig that Gerald mentioned had cost the facility more than most people's houses. Victoria sat in the waiting room, leather chairs, espresso machine, a display case of trophies from concours d'elegance competitions, and answered emails while she waited. 2 hours passed, then 3. Gerald emerged from the workshop with an expression Victoria had never seen on the face of a professional she was paying for. Uncertainty. He sat down across from her, set a printed diagnostic report on the low-glass table between them, and said, carefully, that while their equipment had identified several areas of potential concern, they had been unable to isolate a definitive root cause. The car had started on the lift. The readings were largely normal, but there was something intermittent, something that didn't show up cleanly in any single diagnostic window, that suggested the system was experiencing a fault that their equipment was struggling to classify. He recommended a comprehensive overhaul: ignition system, fuel delivery components, a full wiring harness inspection as a precautionary measure. The estimate was $22,000. Victoria looked at the number, looked at Gerald, and told him to proceed. She called back 8 days later. Gerald told her the work was complete. She picked the car up on a Thursday afternoon, drove it 4 blocks from the facility, and felt the engine stutter. She turned around, pulled back into the Precision Automotive lot, and walked past the receptionist and the trophy case, and Gerald's carefully arranged composure with the controlled energy of a woman who had not yet decided whether to be furious. She sat back down in the leather chair. Gerald went back into the shop. An hour later he came out and told her, with genuine regret in his voice, that the car appeared to be running normally under current conditions and that the fault might be environmental or load dependent. He offered a second round of diagnostics at no charge. Victoria told him she would think about it. She drove home. The engine stuttered again on the bridge. Over the next 3 weeks, she visited 4 more shops, each one recommended by a different person in her network, each one more confident than the last in their initial assessment, and more bewildered by their eventual inability to produce a stable result. A specialist in German classic vehicles in New Jersey, a man named Theodore, who had framed certificates on every wall and spoke with the measured authority of someone who had spent 30 years ensuring that people understood he knew more than they did replace the ECU and 2 oxygen sensors at a cost of $9,000, declared the car corrected, and watched it leave his shop with the quiet confidence of a man who does not consider the possibility of being wrong. A facility in Connecticut that advertised itself as having factory-certified Porsche technicians replaced the fuel pressure regulator and a section of the main wiring harness $14,000 with a 3-page technical report that Victoria read twice without understanding most of it, and that her engineer friend reviewed and described, diplomatically, as thorough without being conclusive. A boutique restoration shop in Brooklyn that charged by the hour and billed with the cheerful impunity of a medical facility ran a full electrical systems audit, found 3 marginally out-of-spec readings, corrected them, and charged $7,000 for the privilege, presenting the bill with the mild righteousness of people who believe the cost of precision cannot be questioned. A 4th shop, a low-profile operation in Pennsylvania, that was recommended to her by a collector who swore the owner had fixed things that Ferrari's own factory techs had given up on, spent 4 days with the car, replaced 2 sensors and a relay cluster, and returned it with a confident handshake and an invoice for $12,000. None of it fixed the problem. The Porsche would run smoothly for a day, sometimes 2, and then the intermittent hesitation would return a subtle roughness at idle, a brief stumble under load, the engine occasionally cutting out entirely for half a second before catching itself and continuing as if nothing had happened. The symptoms were real and measurable, and maddeningly inconsistent, and no diagnostic tool any of these shops had employed seemed capable of capturing them in a reproducible way. Victoria had begun keeping a log on her phone: dates, symptoms, temperatures, how long the car had been running before the fault appeared, with the meticulous documentation habits of someone who manages complex systems for a living. The log grew. The pattern remained elusive. Word had begun to circulate, quietly, in the community of serious collectors that Victoria knew socially, the kind of people who owned aircraft hangars repurposed as garages, that the Harrington 911 might be unfixable, that the car had developed a ghost fault, that even serious money might not be able to bring it back. Victoria heard these rumors through two different people who told her with the poorly concealed satisfaction of people who found it privately enjoyable when someone very confident encountered a problem they couldn't simply buy their way out of. She did not say anything in response to either of them, which was its own kind of answer. She was not sleeping especially well by the time her assistant Marcus mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the guy who had towed the car on that first Saturday, the flatbed driver, a chatty man named Roy, had called the office twice asking if the car had been fixed yet. When Marcus told Roy it hadn't, Roy had expressed sympathy and said that if the fancy shops hadn't solved it yet, maybe she ought to try taking it to Ethan Carter's place over on Millbrook Road. Marcus delivered this information with the brisk neutrality of a man who had learned long ago not to editorialize when relaying messages to Victoria Harrington. Victoria looked up from her laptop, considered the recommendation for approximately 4 seconds, and told Marcus to have the car flatbedded to whatever address Roy had given. She said it the way she said a lot of things, like it was not quite a decision so much as the inevitable conclusion of a logical sequence, and therefore required no further discussion. Millbrook Road turned out to be exactly what the name suggested, a 2-lane road in a part of town where the buildings were low and practical, and the parking lots were full of working vehicles rather than luxury imports. Carter's Automotive occupied a modest converted building with 2 service bays, a hand-painted sign that had weathered at least a few winters, and a gravel lot, where 3 cars were parked at various stages of completion. There was a workbench along the far wall of the first bay, stacked with labeled parts bins, and a row of tools arranged with a specificity that suggested not just tidiness but system, the kind of organization that means everything where it is because it has a reason to be there. The waiting area inside was a single room with 4 plastic chairs, a coffee maker from the previous decade, and a wall calendar from an auto parts supplier featuring a photograph of the Rocky Mountains in autumn. There were no trophies. There was no espresso machine. There was, however, a hand-lettered sign behind the counter that read, "We fix it right the first time, or we don't charge you." Victoria stood in front of this sign for a moment before she fully registered what it said, and then read it again, and then felt an odd, uncomfortable sensation that she eventually identified as the awareness that she had never once seen this offer made by any of the 5 shops that had between them charged her $52,000. None of them had offered to not charge her. It had not occurred to any of them that this was a thing they might need to promise. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment, taking this in, and then walked to the service bay entrance and looked through. A man was working under a truck, lying on a creeper with his legs extended, his hands moving with the economical confidence of someone who had performed the same motion thousands of times. She could see grease on his forearms, a worn pair of work boots, a blue shop rag hanging from the waistband of his coveralls. She asked, to the visible half of the man, if he was Ethan Carter. The creeper slid out from under the truck, and the man who appeared was 48 at a glance, and younger on second look, somewhere around 38, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that assessed her without any of the performance she was accustomed to seeing in people who recognized who she was. He said yes, he was Ethan, and asked what he could do for her. She told him. She told him about the Porsche, the symptoms, the shops, the diagnostics, the cumulative cost of repairs that had not repaired anything, the number she mentioned, $52,000, landing in the air of the garage with a weight she had not quite intended. Ethan listened without interrupting, wiping his hands on the shop rag, his expression attentive and entirely without the deference she usually encountered in service providers who understood what $52,000 represented. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. He asked what the car was doing exactly when it cut out. Was the stumble more pronounced at a specific RPM range? Or was it load-dependent or temperature-dependent? And he asked whether anyone had driven the car for more than 30 minutes continuously and then immediately retested the fault. Victoria stared at him for a moment. In 5 different shops, across 6 weeks of diagnostics, nobody had asked her either of those questions. She told him she didn't know the answer to the first one, and that she had no idea about the second. Ethan nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, and told her he'd take a look. Two men were working in the other bay, a younger mechanic named Dennis, who moved with the eager energy of someone still in his first years of the trade, and an older man named Ray, who had a reputation in the shop for being able to diagnose a failing water pump by listening to it across the parking lot. Both of them glanced at the Porsche when it was rolled in, and both of them glanced at Victoria, and neither of them said anything, which she found mildly unnerving. She was accustomed to spaces where her presence altered the energy of the room. Here it did not seem to, particularly. Ethan walked slowly around the car once before opening the hood. He stood at the front, looking at the engine for a long moment without touching anything, which struck Victoria as strange and not especially promising. Then he turned to her and asked if she wanted to wait inside or if she needed to be somewhere. She said she'd wait. What she told herself, in those first 20 minutes, was that this was a wasted afternoon. She was sitting in a plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled of motor oil and old coffee, checking emails on her phone while a local mechanic looked at a car that had already defeated people with seven-figure equipment budgets. She was here because Roy, the flatbed driver, had called her office twice, which was either an act of genuine helpfulness or a remarkable piece of social audacity, and because she had run out of obvious options. She was not here because she expected results. She was here because she could say she had tried everything. She told herself this clearly and logically, and then kept checking her emails, and the morning passed. Ethan, meanwhile, had done something none of the previous shops had done. He had not plugged in a diagnostic computer. He had not ordered parts. He had not consulted a service manual, or called a technical hotline, or generated an estimate. He had instead taken a small notebook from his chest pocket and begun writing things down. He walked around the car slowly, looking at the engine bay from multiple angles, checking connections by hand rather than by instrument, pressing lightly on wire looms with 2 fingers and watching for any response in the engine's idle. Dennis had asked, once, whether he needed help. And Ethan had said not yet, thanks, in a tone that was friendly and completely definitive. He worked alone and in silence for a long time, occasionally starting the engine and letting it idle while he watched the behavior of various components from a position most mechanics wouldn't have chosen, crouched low, looking upward at the underside of the intake manifold, which received slightly different vibrations during idle than it did under load. Victoria came to the bay entrance around noon, ostensibly to ask whether he had found anything yet, but also if she was honest with herself, because she had run out of the particular kind of patience that comes easily to people who are used to having answers delivered on request. Ethan looked up from his notebook and told her he was still in the observation phase. She told him, with the measured tone of someone choosing their words carefully, that the previous technicians had also spent a great deal of time observing and had not arrived at any useful conclusions. Ethan said, without any apparent irritation, that he understood and that the observation phase was important because the previous technicians appeared to have been looking for what they expected to find rather than what was actually there. Victoria opened her mouth to respond to this and then closed it again, because it was an unexpectedly precise thing to say and because she was not entirely sure it was wrong. By 1 in the afternoon, she had stopped pretending to read her emails. She had moved from the plastic chair to the service bay entrance and was leaning against the doorframe watching Ethan work, which was something she did not quite register herself doing until Ray came to refill his coffee mug, looked at her standing there, and said mildly that Ethan was pretty interesting to watch once you knew what he was doing. She asked what he was doing. Ray said he was eliminating. He said Ethan had a process, and the process was to remove every assumption and start from the known facts outward. Most shops, Ray said, worked the other direction. They started with the most common causes of a given symptom and worked backward. It was usually faster, and it was usually fine. But for intermittent faults, especially on older cars with modified systems and decades of accumulated idiosyncratic repair history, the usual approach tended to create a situation where you were chasing ghosts, because the ghost you were chasing was actually the shadow of a conclusion you'd already made. Victoria listened to Ray say this, considered it, and said nothing. She had made the bet at 11:47 that morning, before she had understood any of this. Ethan had been at the workbench writing in his notebook, and she had been standing in the bay watching him with the simmering frustration of a person who was spending time she did not have on a problem she did not understand, and she had said with the reflexive sharpness of someone used to being the sharpest person in any room she entered, that she had to say, standing here watching him write notes while the car sat untouched, that she was having trouble understanding what distinguished this approach from the approaches of any of the other 5 shops that had also taken a long time and produced no results. She had said this carefully and clearly, and with just enough edge to let him know she was not simply making conversation. Ethan had looked up from his notebook and said, equally clearly, that the difference was that he hadn't decided what was wrong with it yet. She had stared at him, and then, because Victoria Harrington had an instinct for pressure that had served her excellently in business and sometimes betrayed her in human interaction, she had said, fine, if he could fix it, she would give him the Lamborghini. The whole car, title, and everything. The garage had gone quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Dennis had stopped moving. Ray had set down his coffee mug. 3 customers who had been waiting in the reception area, an older man whose sedan was getting a brake job, a young woman waiting on an oil change, and a retired firefighter named Walt, who came in once a month and seemed to mostly come, for the conversation had all arrived in the bay entrance within 30 seconds of each other, drawn by some acoustic property of the silence that had followed her words. Ethan had looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was not angry, and not amused, and not particularly impressed, and then he had looked back at his notebook and said he didn't work for bets. She had told him that wasn't a refusal, that was a deflection. He had said, without looking up, that she could call it whatever she liked. She had told him, and she was aware, even as she said it, that she was pushing harder than the situation called for, that he seemed afraid to try something the experts had already failed at. Ethan had closed his notebook, set it on the bench, and looked at her with the specific quality of patience that belongs to people who have survived things that have nothing to do with business negotiations. He had said he would look at the car. He would look at it because every car had a reason it wasn't working, and it was a mechanic's job to find that reason, not because he had any interest in her Lamborghini. Victoria had said fine. He had said fine. And then he had turned back to the engine, and that had been that. The thing he found. The thing that had eluded 5 different shops and a combined total of somewhere above $50,000 in diagnostic and repair work was a hairline fracture in the body of a vacuum check valve, a small, roughly thumb-sized component made of plastic and rubber that regulated airflow in the evaporative emissions system. The fracture was in a place that was nearly invisible under normal lighting, and that opened and closed depending on temperature, which was why the fault was intermittent. When the engine was cold, the plastic contracted slightly, and the fracture sealed. When the engine reached full operating temperature after sustained driving, the plastic expanded marginally, and the fracture opened, allowing unmetered air to enter the intake stream and disrupt the fuel trim in a way that was subtle enough to fall below the threshold of most diagnostic monitors, but consistent enough to cause the engine management system to hunt oscillating between fuel correction states in a way that produced the stuttering, hesitating behavior that Victoria had been experiencing for 6 weeks. The component itself cost $6.14 from the parts counter 3 blocks away. He had not announced the discovery dramatically. He had come to the reception area where Victoria was sitting with her phone in her hands and said, simply, that he thought he had found it. She followed him to the bay. He showed her the valve, holding it up in the filtered afternoon light coming through the bay door, and indicated the fracture with the tip of one finger, a thin white line along the seam of the component that she would not have noticed if he hadn't pointed directly at it. He explained the mechanism, the temperature dependence, the intermittent nature, the way the resulting air leak was just large enough to confuse the fuel management system without being large enough to trigger a hard fault code. She looked at the component in his hand for a long moment. Then she looked at him. She said, "That's it?" He said, "That was it." She said, "But the other shops ran full diagnostics." He said, "Yes, but their diagnostics were looking for electrical faults and mechanical wear, and this was neither. It was a structural failure of a non-electrical component, in a system that most modern diagnostic software didn't map comprehensively on pre-1980 vehicles, because the system hadn't existed in its current form when the diagnostic protocols were written. The car was old enough that certain assumptions built into contemporary diagnostic tools simply didn't apply to it. He said all of this in the same, even, informational tone he had used to answer her questions earlier, without emphasis and without any apparent interest in whether she was impressed by the explanation. He replaced the valve. The part arrived from the counter 20 minutes after he called Dennis had walked to get it, returning with the small component in a paper bag with the receipt stapled to the outside, which Ethan looked at and then set aside without comment. He installed it in less than 10 minutes, working with the unhurried precision that Victoria had been observing all afternoon. No wasted motion, no second guessing, no consulting a manual, because everything he needed was already in his hands and in his head. He started the engine, let it idle for 3 minutes while watching the data on the scanner, and then drove the car himself out of the lot, down Millbrook Road, onto the county highway for 15 minutes of sustained speed, and back before pulling into the bay and leaving the engine running at idle, while he checked the fuel trim data on the handheld scanner he had connected to the diagnostic port. Dennis was standing near the back of the bay with his arms crossed and his chin slightly raised. The posture of a young mechanic watching his mentor do something worth watching. Ray was pretending to work on something at the bench, but his eyes kept returning to the scanner in Ethan's hand. Walt and the woman waiting on her oil change, and the man with the sedan, had all drifted back to the bay entrance, drawn by the same current of quiet anticipation that had been building in the garage for the past 3 hours. Victoria stood at the front of the car near the open hood, watching the numbers on the scanner's small screen. The numbers were stable. The idle was clean. The engine note, which she had spent 6 weeks listening to with the anxious attention of someone waiting for a wrong note in a piece of music they knew by heart, was even and smooth and exactly right. Ethan let it run for 8 minutes and then looked up from the scanner and said it was done. What happened next happened quickly and slowly at the same time, the way significant moments often do. Dennis said something under his breath that might have been a low whistle of appreciation. Ray set down whatever he had been pretending to work on. Walt shook his head slowly and said he'd be damned. The woman waiting on her oil change began clapping, a single quiet sound that then continued, joined after a moment by Ray and Dennis and Walt and the man with the sedan, a small and genuine applause that filled the bay with something that was not irony and not performance, just the uncomplicated satisfaction of people who had watched someone do something difficult and do it right. Victoria did not move. She stood at the front of the car with one hand resting on the hood, feeling the warmth of the engine through her palm, and she understood something that she had not understood when she walked in that morning, that what she was feeling was not quite the triumphant relief of a problem solved, but something more complicated and harder to name. And then Walt said, "So I guess that Lamborghini's going to Ethan then?" She drove home that evening, and she did not sleep particularly well, which was unusual because she almost always slept well. It was one of the qualities she had cultivated deliberately, the ability to process and release the events of a day rather than carrying them into the dark. But that night, she lay awake and replayed the day with the specific, uncomfortable clarity of someone who suspects they have not been entirely kind to another person and cannot quite find the logical argument that makes it acceptable. She thought about the way she had stood in the garage doorway and assessed Ethan before he had said a word and had composed, in approximately 4 seconds, a complete and confident conclusion about his competence. She had done this automatically, without any awareness that she was doing it, which was the part that bothered her most. She had built an entire career on her ability to read situations and people and make accurate, rapid judgments. And she was, by most measurable standards, very good at it. She had trusted that ability the way an athlete trusts a trained reflex, without questioning whether the reflex was appropriate to every situation. It had not occurred to her that the signals she had learned to read the quality of the building, the equipment, the professional credentials on the wall, the cut of a person's coat, were signals that measured a very specific kind of thing, and that the specific kind of thing they measured had nothing to do with the depth of a person's knowledge or the quality of their character. She thought about the words she had used to describe what she expected him to be able to do. She thought about the bet itself, the theatrical extravagance of it, the way it had been meant to communicate her certainty of his failure, more than any genuine desire to wager the car. She had used the Lamborghini the way she sometimes used money in negotiations, as a signal of her position rather than a real stake, because she had not for a moment believed the stake would be called. The fact that she had been so certain of his failure, certain enough to make the offer publicly, in front of a room full of people, was itself the thing she found hardest to sit with. It was not an error of judgment. It was an error of assumption. And the difference between those two things, she thought, lying in the dark, with the sounds of the city outside her window, was the difference between a mistake you can learn from and a habit you have to actively unlearn. The next morning she went back. She brought coffee, 2 cups from the good place, 3 blocks from her hotel, and she arrived before the shop opened and waited in the gravel lot until she heard sounds from inside. When Ethan unlocked the bay door and found her standing there with the coffee, he showed no particular surprise, which she found inexplicably reassuring. She handed him one of the cups and said she wanted to apologize. He said she didn't need to. She said she thought she did. He accepted this with the same evenness he had brought to everything else, in a way that made it feel less like forgiveness and more like the quiet acknowledgement that they had simply moved from one part of the conversation to another. She asked him, after a moment of silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, how long he had been doing this. He said 15 years, give or take. She asked where he had trained. He said he had started working in his uncle's shop at 17, done a 2-year technical program at night while working full-time at 22, and spent the rest of the time learning from the cars themselves. He said that last part simply, without any particular emphasis, but she had been listening to how people talked about their work for long enough to recognize the difference between someone reciting credentials and someone describing a relationship. She asked if he had always worked on his own. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said it was mostly just him and his daughter now. She asked what that meant. He told her about his wife, who had died 4 years earlier, cancer, fast and total, leaving him with a 7-year-old girl named Sophie and a shop lease he had just signed. He had kept both. He was still keeping both. She sat with this for a moment, the cup warm in her hands, the October morning settling around them in the gravel lot. She thought about what it meant to keep going, not the motivational poster version of that phrase, but the actual mechanical reality of it, the daily discipline of showing up to a small shop on Millbrook Road and doing precise, excellent work for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition or compensation, and everything to do with the fact that the work needed to be done, and you were the person capable of doing it. She asked, because she genuinely wanted to know what made him keep going every day. He thought about it for a moment, which she had noticed was a thing he did. He didn't fill silence with words when he didn't have words ready. Then he said that Sophie liked to watch him work. He said she sat on the stool in the corner sometimes after school and did her homework. And occasionally she asked questions about what he was doing, and he answered them. He said there was something about explaining how things worked to someone who actually wanted to understand that clarified his own thinking. He said he figured if he could make one car run properly for one person who needed it to run, that was a day that had meant something. He said this without any inflection that suggested he was making a larger point. Victoria looked at him and felt something that she would have had difficulty naming in a business context, a quality of attention, of recognition, that was not admiration exactly, and not envy exactly, but something that incorporated both. She asked about the Lamborghini. She said she had brought the paperwork, and she held up a folder. He shook his head before she had finished the sentence. She told him she meant it, that she had said she would do it, and she kept her commitments. He said he appreciated that, and that he believed her, but that he hadn't fixed the car to win a bet. He said he didn't want to own a Lamborghini. She asked what he did want. He thought about it again in that particular way of his, and said what he mostly wanted was to expand the diagnostic work, to be able to take on more complex cases, older vehicles, cars that other shops turned away because they didn't have the patience or the knowledge base to work through intermittent and irregular faults. He said there was a whole category of well-maintained classic and vintage vehicles whose owners were being told the cars were unfixable, when the truth was that contemporary diagnostic infrastructure simply wasn't well suited to them. He said there was a real need there, and that he had thought about it for a while, and that he didn't have the capital or the operational scale to address it on his own. He said this last part in the tone of a person describing a fact, not making a request. Victoria, who had spent her entire career learning to hear the space between what people said and what they actually needed, sat very still for a moment and then asked if she could come back on Friday. What followed over the next 6 months was not a neat story of overnight transformation. It was, like most real things, messier and slower and more interesting than that. Victoria brought in an operations consultant she trusted to do a market analysis, a woman named Patricia who had spent 20 years assessing underserved niches in specialty service industries, and who delivered her findings with the directness of someone who had long since stopped softening numbers for clients who could handle the truth. The analysis confirmed what Ethan had described: a significant and underserved population of classic and vintage vehicle owners in the Northeast who had been unable to find qualified, patient, technically sophisticated repair service, and had either stored their vehicles indefinitely or been subjected to cycles of expensive, inconclusive diagnostic work that solved nothing and cost everything. The addressable market was larger than Victoria had estimated. The barrier to entry was not capital, it was knowledge, specifically the kind of slow, accumulated, pattern recognition knowledge that took 15 years to develop and could not be replicated by buying better equipment. That was why Ethan's garage was already booked 3 weeks out despite having no marketing budget, no website worth mentioning, and a location that required someone to specifically know it existed. The customers who found it stayed. They told other people. The business had been growing by word of mouth for 4 years, not because Ethan had tried to grow it, but because the work was good enough that people could not help talking about it. Victoria proposed a network of 3 to 5 regional facilities operating under a shared brand, with Ethan serving as technical director, setting the diagnostic protocols, training the technicians, establishing the quality standards that would define what the brand meant in practice. She would handle the capital, the real estate, the operational infrastructure, the marketing. Ethan would handle the work. The equity split she proposed was generous to a degree that made her attorney look up from the term sheet and ask if she had read it correctly. She said she had. Her attorney asked if she was sure. She said she was very sure. And she said it in the tone that her attorney had learned, over 6 years of working together, meant the topic was not open for further discussion. Ethan said no the first time. He said he needed to think. She said of course. She left the term sheet and went back to the city. He called her 11 days later and said he had talked it through with Sophie, who had told him that if the nice lady in the expensive coat wanted to make his shop bigger so he could fix more cars, he should probably say yes because that sounded like a good thing. He said he found Sophie's analysis fairly persuasive. Victoria laughed a genuine, unprepared laugh that surprised her slightly and said she thought Sophie sounded like a very reasonable person. Ethan said she had her moments. The first location under the new brand opened 8 months after Victoria walked into Carter's Automotive on Millbrook Road. The second followed 4 months later. By the end of the first year, there were 4 facilities, a wait list that ran 6 weeks for initial consultations on complex cases, and a reputation built almost entirely through word of mouth in the collector community for being the only network in the region that would take on the jobs no one else wanted and actually fix them. The brand identity Victoria's team developed was deliberately understated. A simple wordmark, muted colors. Nothing that shouted luxury or performance. Ethan had asked for that specifically, and she had agreed without argument. The work was the thing. The work needed to be able to speak for itself. Victoria still drove the Porsche. She drove it on weekends when she could, on the same kinds of 2-lane roads where it had died 14 months earlier, and she listened to the engine with a different quality of attention than she had before, not the anxious monitoring of someone waiting for a fault to recur, but something closer to the attentiveness of someone who had learned to appreciate a thing more precisely after almost losing it. She brought it to Ethan's original shop on Millbrook Road for its annual service, which he performed himself despite having a staff of 12, across 4 locations, and no particular obligation to stay hands-on. He did it because he wanted to. She understood that about him now, the distinction between what he did because it was required and what he did because it was right, and the fact that he didn't spend a lot of time explaining the difference. She was there on a Tuesday in December, when Sophie came in after school, 11 years old now, wearing a winter coat with a backpack that was almost as big as she was, climbing onto the stool in the corner of the service bay, with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing exactly this for as long as she could remember. She pulled out a notebook and a pencil and began working on something, and then looked up at the car her father was working on and asked what was wrong with it. Ethan said he was trying to figure out why the fuel pressure was dropping at sustained highway speed. Sophie considered this, and then said maybe it was a clogged fuel filter. Ethan looked up from the engine bay with an expression that Victoria would have described, if pressed, as pride filtered through the careful discretion of a person who didn't want to make a big deal of something in front of someone who would find it embarrassing. He said that was actually one of the things he was checking. Sophie nodded with the brisk satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed and went back to her notebook. Victoria stood in the bay entrance, watching this, the man and his daughter, and the car, and the afternoon light coming through the roll-up door, and the particular quality of quiet that existed in this space, which was not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of complete absorption. And she thought about the morning 14 months ago, when she had stood in this same doorway and looked at the same man and had understood nothing about him at all. She thought about the $52,000 she had spent to not fix a car, and the $6 that had fixed it, and she thought about what those two numbers meant, not as a joke about expertise versus experience, but as an actual diagram of the difference between knowing the price of something and knowing its value, and how she had walked into this garage and assessed the wrong thing entirely. The clothes, the location, the decor of the waiting room, all the signals she had spent her career learning to read, and how perfectly useless every one of them had been in the face of a man who simply knew how things worked and cared about doing them right. She looked at the Porsche engine running now, smooth and steady, the midnight blue paint catching the December light in that particular way it had, and she found herself thinking that the most valuable thing she had acquired in the past 14 months was not the business, not the network, not the market position or the revenue multiple that her CFO had already described as exceptional. It was something much simpler and much harder to quantify. She had walked into a small garage on a road she would never have driven down by choice, and had met someone who reminded her that genuine competence is not loud, that real knowledge travels light, and that the people who know the most about what they're doing often have the least interest in telling you about it. She had needed to be wrong thoroughly, expensively, undeniably wrong to understand this. The Porsche had been the instrument of that education. $6 had been the tuition. She stood there a moment longer, listening to the engine. And then she smiled, not the smile she wore in photographs and on magazine covers and at the head of conference tables, but the quieter, less managed expression of someone who has arrived, after a long and complicated route, at something true. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her what she had learned from all of this, from the $52,000 and the $6 part, and the man in the grease-stained coveralls who had asked the people.coms two questions that nobody else had thought to ask. She thought she might say something like this, that the most expensive lesson she had ever bought cost $6, and it had nothing to do with cars. It was the lesson that talent does not announce itself, that wisdom does not require an audience, that the most important questions are sometimes the ones that nobody else has thought to ask, not because the answers are hidden, but because asking them first requires you to empty yourself of everything you already think you know. And most people, most of the time, are too attached to what they know to make that kind of room. That the person standing in front of you in worn work boots and grease-stained coveralls might understand your most complicated problem with a clarity that every credential holder you've paid handsomely has entirely missed, not because they're smarter than those people, but because they are not afraid of what they don't know yet, and that fearlessness is the beginning of every real solution. That there is a difference, finally, between the price of something and its value, and that she had spent her entire adult life being very sophisticated about price, and only now, at 35, in a gravel lot on Millbrook Road, with a cup of gas station coffee going cold in her hand, beginning to understand the other thing. She had bet a Lamborghini on a man's failure, and discovered, in the most direct possible way, that the things worth knowing cannot be priced. The things worth knowing are held by people who are simply too busy doing the work to bother charging you what they're worth. Sophie asked her father if he wanted a snack. Ethan said yes. Sophie produced a granola bar from her backpack, with the efficiency of someone who had handled this particular logistics problem many times before. The engine ran. The light shifted. Victoria Harrington turned up the collar of her coat and walked back to her car, not the Lamborghini, not the Ferrari, but the midnight blue Porsche that had started all of this, and thought that she would drive home the long way, through the two-lane roads, with the window down, listening to an engine that ran perfectly, fixed by hands that knew what they were doing, and a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life in the place where her certainty used to be.